The training floor went silent the moment the alarm bell rang, and I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. I am Kira Voss, Cadet number 11, the only human in a class of 43 officers from 6 different worlds, and I had just watched a Threxian cadet named Doric snap a steel practice bar in half with his bare hands like it was a twig. The instructor, a tall Valari officer named Commander Aldrich Vance, folded his forearms and looked around the room with a thin, amused smile. "This," he said, gesturing at Doric, "is what real strength looks like. Bred for war. Built for pain, a body that does not know fear." A few cadets laughed. Somebody in the back row muttered something about legends, about old stories of a species so fragile they needed machines just to breathe on half the worlds in the galaxy. I kept my hands folded on my lap and said nothing, because I had learned, in my first 3 weeks at the academy, that silence was safer than explaining myself to people who had already decided what I was. Long ago, Vance continued, pacing in front of the class, there were rumors of a race called the Deathworlders. Supposedly from a planet so hostile that only the strongest creatures survived. Stories claimed they could endure gravity that would crush a Valari skeleton, diseases that would liquefy an Ontrali lung, temperatures that would freeze a Threxian blood system solid. Legends, of course. Exaggerations passed down by traders who wanted a good story to sell. He stopped in front of my seat and looked down at me with an expression I had already learned to recognize, curiosity mixed with condescension. "Cadet Voss," he said, "you are from Earth, are you not?" "Yes, sir," I said. The room erupted into quiet laughter again. Someone whispered the word legend like it was a punchline. Vance smiled wider. "Then perhaps you would like to demonstrate for the class what a Deathworlder can do." I felt my pulse tick up, not from fear, but from something closer to relief. I had been waiting 3 weeks for someone to finally ask. I raised my hand. The laughter stopped. "I volunteer," I said. Vance blinked, clearly not expecting an answer at all, let alone that one. He recovered quickly, waving toward the center mat where Doric still stood, chest heaving from his last demonstration, muscles the size of tree trunks glistening under the harsh training lights. "Very well," Vance said. "Cadet Doric, if you would." Doric grinned, showing teeth built for tearing through tough hide. He had been the top physical specimen in our class since day 1, a Threxian soldier, bred on a world with triple Earth gravity, raised from birth to become a weapon. Every cadet in the room had watched him bend metal, crack stone, and lift weights that would have snapped a normal human spine. I stood up from my seat, feeling the stairs crawl across my skin like static electricity, and walked to the center of the mat. Somebody in the crowd, a Savathi cadet named Ilna Kaur, called out, "This won't take long." I looked at Doric, who towered over me by nearly 2 feet, and I thought about my grandmother, who used to tell me stories about her own grandmother, about how humans had survived ice ages, and plagues, and wars that wiped out entire cities, and how somehow, every single time, there had been someone left standing at the end to keep going. I thought about how nobody in this room understood what that meant. Not yet. "Rules are simple," Vance said, stepping back to give us room. "First one to yield or lose consciousness loses. No weapons. No permanent injury allowed. Understood?" "Understood," Doric said, cracking his knuckles. "Understood," I said. Vance raised his hand, then dropped it. "Begin." Doric moved first, faster than I expected for someone his size, closing the distance between us in 2 long strides and throwing a heavy punch aimed at my shoulder. I twisted sideways, letting it graze past me, and felt the wind of it brush my sleeve. The crowd gasped, more from surprise that I had dodged at all than from anything else. Doric recovered quickly and swung again, and this time I did not dodge. I let the blow land on my forearm, absorbing the impact instead of avoiding it, and I heard several cadets in the crowd wince at the sound. It hurt. I will not pretend it did not hurt, but pain, to a human, is information, not a stop sign. Doric's eyes widened slightly when I did not fall. "You are supposed to go down," he said, almost confused. "I know," I said, and stepped forward instead of back. I threw a strike of my own, aimed low, into the side of his knee, using leverage instead of raw power, and felt him stumble for just a moment before catching himself. The crowd had gone completely silent now. Even Vance had stopped pacing. Doric came at me again, angrier this time, throwing a series of quick blows meant to overwhelm me before I could recover. I took 2 of them on my arms, let one graze my ribs, and used the opening it created to drive my elbow into his side. He grunted, actual surprise flashing across his face, and for the first time since I had met him, he hesitated. That hesitation was all I needed. I do not need to explain every movement of what happened next, because what mattered was not the fight itself, but the moment 30 seconds later when Doric finally went still on the mat, breathing hard, unable to push himself back up, staring at the ceiling like he was trying to understand what had just happened to him. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Vance walked over slowly, checked Doric's pulse, then looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something between disbelief and calculation. "Cadet Voss wins," he said quietly. Nobody clapped, nobody spoke. 42 cadets from 6 different worlds stared at me like I had just performed something impossible. I helped Doric sit up, offering my hand, and after a moment of clear internal conflict, he took it. "How," he said, voice rough, "did you do that?" I thought about how to answer that honestly without sounding arrogant, without pretending it had been easy, because it had not been easy. My arms were already turning purple where his blows had landed. My ribs ached with every breath. "My body doesn't quit just because something hurts," I said. "Where I'm from, if you stop when it hurts, you don't get to try again later." Doric studied my face for a long moment, then looked at his own hands, the hands that had broken steel an hour earlier, now trembling slightly from exhaustion. "The old stories," he said slowly, "about the Deathworlders. They're not stories," I said. "We're just the last ones anyone bothered writing down." Vance cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control of a classroom that no longer looked at him the same way it had 10 minutes ago. "Interesting," he said, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "Class dismissed. Cadet Voss, report to the medical bay for evaluation." I nodded, picked up my jacket from the bench, and walked toward the door, feeling every pair of eyes in that room follow me the entire way. Behind me, I heard Ilna Kaur whisper something to the cadet beside her, and though I could not make out the exact words, I recognized the tone. Fear. Not the kind of fear you feel from an enemy, but the kind you feel when the story you always believed about the world turns out to be wrong, and you suddenly have to wonder what else you got wrong along with it. I stepped out into the hallway, and the cold air of the academy corridor hit my bruised skin like a splash of water, sharp and clarifying. 3 weeks ago, I had been told, quietly, by an academy liaison, that humans were being allowed into officer training as a diplomatic courtesy, a gesture to a species that had only recently joined the wider galactic community, a species most of the instructors privately believed would wash out within the first month. I had smiled and nodded and said nothing, because arguing with people who have already made up their minds is a waste of breath. But standing in that hallway, listening to the murmur of stunned voices drifting out from the training room behind me, I understood that something had shifted, not because I had won a sparring match. Fights like that happened every day at the academy, and nobody outside that room would remember it by tomorrow. What had shifted was smaller and far more dangerous than a single match. For the first time since I had arrived, someone had looked at me, really looked at me, and wondered if the legend might be true. I made my way down the corridor toward the medical bay, my ribs aching with every step, and I thought about how many more times I would have to prove the same thing before people finally believed it without needing to see it firsthand. I did not yet know that the true test was still ahead of me, that this quiet victory in a training room would ripple outward into something far larger than a sparring match, something that would eventually force the entire academy, and perhaps the wider concordance itself, to reconsider everything it thought it knew about the fragile, forgotten species from a planet called Earth. But that morning, walking down that cold corridor with bruises blooming under my sleeves, all I knew was this: they had called us legends. And legends, I had just proven, were not always exaggerations. Sometimes they were warnings nobody had bothered to take seriously. The medical bay doors slid open ahead of me, and a nurse from a species I did not recognize looked up, startled, already reaching for a scanner. I stepped inside, and the door closed behind me with a soft hiss, sealing away the stunned silence of the training room, though I knew, even then, that silence would not last. Word traveled fast at the academy. By tomorrow, everyone would know my name, and some of them, I suspected, would already be trying to figure out how to prove that what they had seen was a fluke, a trick, an exception, rather than a rule. I lay back on the medical table, closed my eyes, and let myself smile for the first time in 3 weeks. Let them try. The medical bay lights flickered once, and a nurse named Priya Marsh pressed a cold scanner against my ribs, frowning at the readout like it had personally offended her. "You should be in far worse condition than this," she said, tilting the scanner toward me so I could see the numbers glowing on its surface. "According to this, you have 2 hairline fractures and severe bruising across both forearms, yet your vital signs read as though you finished a light jog." "I heal fast," I said. "Fast is not the word I would use," she muttered, tapping something into her console. "This is unusual." I did not tell her that unusual was, for humans, simply another word for normal. Word of the sparring match spread through the academy faster than I expected. By the time I limped out of the medical bay 2 hours later, cadets I had never spoken to were already whispering as I passed, some with open curiosity, others with something closer to suspicion. I made my way back toward the dormitory wing, my ribs still aching under a fresh wrap of medical gel, when a voice called out behind me, "Cadet Voss." I turned and found Sel Very standing in the corridor, arms crossed, her pale blue skin catching the overhead light in a way that made her look carved from ice. She was the top-ranked cadet in strategic combat theory, a Valari like Commander Vance, sharp-minded and famously unwilling to accept anything she could not personally verify. "You have a reputation for asking difficult questions," I said. "I have a reputation for asking honest ones," she replied. "Which is not always the same thing as difficult, though I understand how you might confuse the two." I waited, sensing there was more. "I watched the recording of your match," she said. 3 times, in fact, and I do not believe what I saw." "You saw a fight," I said. "I won it. I saw a species with no recorded history of interstellar combat defeat a Threxian soldier bred for exactly that purpose," she said. "Forgive me if I find that difficult to accept without further evidence." "What kind of evidence would satisfy you?" She studied me for a long moment, the way a scientist studies a specimen that refuses to behave the way the textbooks predicted. "A controlled trial," she said, "something that cannot be explained away as luck, or as your opponent underestimating you. I propose the Kasari range." I felt my stomach tighten slightly at the name. Every cadet at the academy had heard of the Kasari range, a training world rated Class 4 hostile, a place with gravity nearly double standard, toxic vegetation, and predators large enough to swallow a shuttle pod whole. Most species required full environmental suits and armed escort teams simply to survive an afternoon there. "You want me to go to Kasari alone," I said. "I want the truth," Selvari said. "If your species is what the old stories claim, Kasari will prove it. If not, at least the Academy will stop wasting resources pretending otherwise." Before I could answer, a new voice cut into the conversation. "That is an extremely reckless proposal, Cadet Very." We both turned to see Commander Vance approaching down the corridor, his expression unreadable. "With respect, Commander," Selvari said, "the entire Academy is currently debating whether Cadet Voss's victory was a genuine demonstration of ability or an isolated incident. I believe a survival trial would settle the matter definitively." Vance looked at me, and I saw something calculating behind his eyes, something that told me he was already imagining how this could be used, one way or another, to make a point to the wider concordance. The Academy does not typically approve solo survival trials for first-year cadets, he said slowly, but given the unusual circumstances surrounding Cadet Voss, I am willing to make an exception, provided she agrees. Every instinct told me this was a trap disguised as an opportunity, a chance for someone to either watch me fail spectacularly in front of the entire command staff or to gather evidence that could be used against humanity in negotiations I was not even aware were happening. But I also understood something Selvari and Vance did not. I understood that every time I refused to prove myself, the doubt would only grow larger, until eventually it would not matter what I actually did, because the story about human weakness would already be written into Academy record as fact. I accept, I said. Vance nodded slowly. Very well. The trial will take place in 1 week's time. I suggest you use it wisely, Cadet Voss. He turned and walked away, leaving Selvari studying me with an expression that had shifted, almost imperceptibly, from suspicion toward something like curiosity. You did not hesitate, she said. Hesitating wouldn't change the outcome, I said. It would only change how much time I had to prepare. For the first time since I had met her, something that might have been the beginning of respect flickered across her face. I look forward to being proven wrong, Cadet Voss, she said, and walked away before I could respond. That night, I lay awake in my narrow dormitory bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of 2 Entrali cadets arguing about navigation calculations 3 rooms down. I thought about the Kasari range, about the survival statistics Priya Marsh had quietly shown me before I left the medical bay, statistics that listed a 70% injury rate among trained escort teams who had ventured there in the past year alone. I thought about my grandmother again, about the stories she used to tell me on quiet evenings back home, stories about people who had crossed frozen oceans on foot, who had survived years trapped in collapsed mines, with nothing but determination and the refusal to accept that survival was impossible. I did not have her stories memorized word for word, but I remembered the feeling they left behind, the certainty that humans had never once been the strongest, the fastest, or the most naturally gifted species on our own planet, and yet somehow we were the ones still standing at the end of every story worth telling. 3 days into my preparation, I began noticing something strange. Cadets who had once avoided eye contact with me now sought me out in the mess hall, asking careful, probing questions about Earth, about our history, about how a species with no natural claws, no venom, no armored hide had managed to survive long enough to build starships at all. An Entrali cadet named Faroon Idesh, who studied comparative biology, cornered me during a meal to ask about human sleep patterns, visibly disturbed to learn that most humans instinctively kept some form of weapon or barrier near them while resting, a habit so deeply ingrained that most of us never even questioned why we did it. You sleep prepared for an attack, he said, horrified. Every night, as a species. Most of the time, nothing happens, I said, but when it does, you want to already be ready. That's not paranoia where I'm from. That's just Tuesday. He stared at me like I had described something from a nightmare, and I realized, watching his expression shift, that what felt mundane to me was genuinely alarming to a species that had evolved in relative safety, protected by ecosystems that had never demanded the same brutal, constant vigilance that Earth had. By the 5th day, rumors about my upcoming trial had spread beyond the cadet corps entirely. I overheard 2 instructors in the corridor outside the officers' lounge discussing whether the Academy command staff intended to observe the trial directly, and whether representatives from the wider Concordance government might request access to the recorded footage. I began to understand, slowly and with a growing weight in my chest, that this was no longer simply about proving myself to a classroom of skeptical cadets. This was about proving something to an entire galaxy that had only recently discovered humanity existed at all, a galaxy that was still deciding, in quiet committee rooms and diplomatic channels I would never see, whether Earth deserved a seat at the table or merely tolerance as a curious, fragile new arrival. Selveri found me again on the sixth evening, this time in the training yard where I had been running laps under the harsh simulated gravity setting, trying to push my endurance as far as I could before the trial began. She watched silently for several minutes before speaking. "You have not slowed down once," she observed. "Slowing down isn't part of the plan," I said, breathing hard but steady. "May I ask you something honestly, Cadet Voss?" I stopped running, wiping sweat from my forehead, and nodded. "Are you afraid of Kesari?" I considered lying, considered giving her the confident answer she probably expected, the answer that would fit the growing legend already forming around me in whispered corridor conversations. Instead, I told her the truth. "Yes," I said, "I'd be foolish not to be, but being afraid and being unable are two very different things. My species learned that difference a long time ago, usually the hard way." Selveri studied me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her pale eyes. "That," she said quietly, "may be the most honest thing anyone at this academy has said to me all year." She turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth," she added, "I hope the stories are true, Cadet Voss, not because I want to be proven wrong, but because if they are true, it means something rare still exists in this galaxy, something worth protecting." She walked away before I could respond, leaving me alone in the training yard under the artificial gravity that pressed down on my shoulders like a physical warning of what was still to come. I looked up at the simulated night sky projected onto the yard's ceiling, thousands of unfamiliar stars arranged in patterns that meant nothing to me yet, and somewhere beyond all of them, impossibly far away, was a small blue planet that had shaped every instinct currently keeping me alive in this strange new world. 1 week, I thought. 1 week until Kesari, and somewhere in the back of my mind, quiet but unmistakable, I felt the same stubborn certainty my grandmother's voice always carried in her stories. We had survived worse. We would survive this too. 2 days before the trial, I woke to the sound of my dormitory door chiming at an hour when no visitor should have reasonably called. I opened it to find a cadet I barely recognized, a thin, nervous entrali named Faroon Idesh, glancing anxiously down both directions of the corridor before slipping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Close the door," he whispered. I did, more out of curiosity than obedience, and folded my arms as I studied him. His hands were trembling slightly, and his usual calm, scholarly demeanor had been replaced by something closer to panic. "You study biology," I said. "Not exactly the sort of person who shows up at my door in the middle of the night." "I overheard something," he said quietly, "in the science wing, 2 staff members, discussing your trial." I felt my earlier drowsiness vanish entirely. "What kind of discussing?" Faroon hesitated, glancing at the door again as though expecting someone to burst through it at any moment. "There is a faction within the academy," he said, "cadets and instructors both, who believe your species joining the concordance threatens the current balance of power among member worlds. Several delegations depend heavily on their military reputation for diplomatic leverage. If a newly discovered species proves capable of matching or exceeding their combat abilities, it weakens their negotiating position considerably. So they want me to fail," I said slowly. "Worse," he said. "I believe they intend to ensure it." My stomach tightened. "What did you hear, exactly?" "They mentioned altering the Kesari trial parameters," Faroon said, "increasing predator density in the sector assigned to you, beyond what is normally permitted for a first-year survival exercise. If successful, your failure would be attributed entirely to your own limitations, rather than to any interference. No one would suspect sabotage." I sat down slowly on the edge of my bunk, processing what he had just told me. Around us, the dormitory hummed quietly with the sound of other cadets sleeping, unaware that somewhere in this very academy, People were quietly working to ensure that my trial became something closer to an execution than a test. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "You barely know me." Faroon was quiet for a long moment, his large dark eyes searching mine. "Because science should be honest," he said finally. "If your species truly possesses the resilience the old legends describe, then that is a fact worth discovering honestly, through fair observation. Not something to be buried by people afraid of what it might mean for their own position. I did not become a scientist to watch the truth be murdered before it could even be spoken." I studied his face, searching for any sign of deception, but found only the same nervous sincerity that had brought him to my door in the first place. "Do you know who's behind this?" I asked. "Not with certainty," he said, "but I recognized one voice. Instructor Halden Cross, from the Tactical Systems Division. He has ties to several off-world defense contractors. If the Deathworlder legends are confirmed, and your species gains full military recognition within the Concordance, certain existing supply agreements could become significantly less profitable." The pieces clicked together with uncomfortable clarity. This was never simply about proving a myth true or false. It was about protecting interests that had existed long before I had ever set foot on this academy. Interests that saw humanity not as a species to understand, but as a threat to be quietly neutralized before it ever gained enough influence to matter. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "You're taking a real risk coming here." "I know," he said, standing to leave. "Be careful, Cadet Voss. Whatever they release into that sector, it will not be an accident." After he left, I sat alone in the darkness of my dormitory for a long time, thinking. I could report what Faroon had told me, of course. I could go to Commander Vance, or even higher, and demand an investigation into Instructor Cross and his suspected allies. But I understood, even as the thought formed, how quickly such an accusation could be dismissed. I had no proof beyond second-hand testimony from a frightened cadet who had overheard a conversation he was not supposed to hear. Cross would simply deny everything, and I would be labeled paranoid at best, or a liar at worst, exactly the kind of controversy that would undermine everything I had worked to prove so far. No, if they wanted to test me with an unfair trial, I would need to survive it anyway, and find a way to expose the truth once it was already too late for them to hide it. The next morning, I sought out Sel Vari during the brief window between morning drills and strategic theory class, finding her alone in the library archive, reviewing old mission reports on a glowing data terminal. "I need to ask you something," I said quietly, sliding into the seat beside her, "and I need you to trust that I have a good reason for asking it." She studied my expression carefully before nodding. "Go ahead." "If someone wanted to alter the parameters of a survival trial without official authorization," I said, "how would they do it, and who would be capable of covering their tracks well enough that nobody would notice?" Her posture stiffened, almost imperceptibly. "Why do you ask?" I told her everything Faroon had shared with me, watching her expression shift from skepticism to genuine alarm as the details accumulated. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, staring at the data terminal without really seeing it. "This is a serious accusation," she said finally. "I know. If true, it would violate at least 4 separate Academy regulations, and likely several concordance treaties regarding fair treatment of new member species." "I know that too," I said. "Which is exactly why they'll deny it, and exactly why we need proof before we can accuse anyone of anything." Selvari's fingers moved across the terminal, pulling up records I did not fully understand, star charts and logistics manifests scrolling past faster than I could read them. "Trial parameter modifications require dual authorization," she said slowly. "Typically, an instructor and a logistics officer. If Instructor Cross intends to alter your sector's predator density, he would need someone in supply logistics willing to falsify the necessary permits. Can you find out who that might be?" She hesitated, and for a moment I thought she might refuse entirely, that the risk to her own reputation was simply too great to justify helping a cadet she had known for less than 2 weeks. Instead, she met my eyes with an expression of quiet determination I had not seen from her before. "I told you I wanted the truth," she said. "This is still the truth, just uglier than either of us expected." Over the following day, working in careful secrecy between our regular classes, Selveri and I pieced together enough evidence to confirm what Faroon had warned me about. A logistics officer named Petra Van had authorized an unusual supply requisition 3 days earlier, additional live predator specimens transported to a holding facility adjacent to the Kasari Range, officially listed under a vague designation of routine ecosystem maintenance. The timing was impossible to ignore. "They're planning to release additional apex predators into your assigned sector," Selvari said grimly, staring at the requisition records. "Species that do not naturally occur in that region of Kasari at all. If your survival statistics were already concerning under normal conditions, this would push the danger level well beyond anything a first-year cadet should reasonably be expected to survive." "Then I won't survive it under normal conditions," I said. "I'll survive it by refusing to play by their expectations." Selvari looked at me, something like grudging admiration flickering across her expression. "You are remarkably calm for someone who just learned people are actively trying to kill you." "I'm not calm," I admitted. "I'm angry, but anger that makes you reckless gets you killed just as fast as fear does. So I'm choosing to be useful instead. What do you intend to do?" I thought carefully before answering, weighing every option against the very real possibility that a single misstep could end not only my own future at the Academy, but potentially damage the fragile trust humanity had only just begun building with the wider concordance. "I'm going to go through with the trial exactly as scheduled," I said finally. "But I want you and Faroon recording everything, every predator movement, every deviation from the standard Kasari parameters, time-stamped and verified. If they've sabotaged this trial, I want proof that survives even if I don't." "That is an extraordinarily dangerous plan," Selveri said. "It's the only plan that doesn't require me to accuse a respected instructor of a crime I can't yet prove," I said. "If I go through with it and survive, the evidence you gather becomes undeniable. If Cross gets caught trying to sabotage a legitimate Academy trial, it exposes exactly the kind of corruption the Concordance claims not to tolerate. But if I refuse to go, or accuse him prematurely, all of this disappears, and he simply tries again some other way, better hidden next time." Selvari was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the moral weight of what I was proposing. Finally she nodded, slow and deliberate. "Then I will document everything," she said. "And Cadet Voss, if the parameters truly are as altered as we suspect, you will need every advantage available to you. Survival instinct alone may not be enough this time. It's been enough before," I said, though even as I said it, I understood the stakes had shifted into something far more dangerous than a training exercise gone slightly wrong. That evening, Faroon returned with more troubling information, confirming through a contact in the veterinary division that the additional predator species being introduced to my sector were Kralith stalkers, apex hunters known for their ability to track prey through solid rock formations and their resistance to standard stun weaponry. "They are not native to Kasari," Faroon said grimly. "Someone specifically selected them because they would present an almost insurmountable challenge to a lone, lightly equipped cadet." "How insurmountable?" I asked. Faroon hesitated, clearly reluctant to answer honestly. The last recorded encounter between a Kralith stalker and an unprepared ground team resulted in 3 fatalities before extraction forces could intervene, he said quietly. "You would be facing potentially multiple stalkers, alone, with no extraction team standing by, unless Selveri and I can convince command staff that irregularities exist." The weight of what I was walking into settled fully across my shoulders for the first time, heavy and undeniable. This was no longer a demonstration meant to prove a point to a skeptical classroom. This had become, through the quiet malice of people I had never even met, something far closer to a genuine attempt on my life, carefully disguised as an unfortunate training accident. I thought about walking away entirely, about reporting everything immediately to Commander Vance, and demanding the trial be cancelled before I ever set foot on that hostile world. but I also understood something the people plotting against me clearly did not. They believed the old Deathworlder legends were simply exaggerated stories, convenient myths that could be quietly disproven and buried once and for all through a carefully engineered accident. They did not understand that the entire history of my species was built upon exactly this kind of moment. Moments where the odds had been stacked deliberately against us, where more powerful forces had assumed our extinction was simply a matter of time and inevitability. And every single time, throughout every chapter of our long, brutal, magnificent history, humanity had refused to accept that inevitability as fact. "I'm still going," I told Faroon and Selvari that night, my voice steady despite the fear coiling tightly in my chest. "But now I know what's coming, and knowing changes everything." Selvari studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, understanding settling behind her pale eyes. "Then we will be watching," she said, "every step of the way. And Cadet Voss, if the old stories about your kind are even partially true, I suspect Instructor Cross has made a very serious miscalculation." 2 days remained before Kasari. 2 days to prepare not simply for a hostile alien wilderness, but for predators specifically chosen to kill me, released by people who believed the legend of the Deathworlders was nothing more than a story worth burying. I intended to prove, once and for all, exactly how wrong they were. The transport shuttle dropped through the thick amber clouds of Kasari with a violence that rattled my teeth, and the moment the loading ramp opened, the air hit me like a physical blow, thick, hot, and heavy with the smell of something rotting deep beneath the soil. "Gravity at 1.9 standard," the shuttle pilot called back to me, not bothering to hide the doubt in her voice. "You have 6 hours to reach the extraction beacon at grid point Delta 7. Good luck, Cadet Voss." I stepped down onto the cracked red ground, feeling the increased gravity settle into my bones like an extra weight strapped across my shoulders, and watched the shuttle lift away, leaving me utterly alone beneath a sky the color of an old bruise. My earpiece crackled softly. "Voss, this is Selvari. Can you hear me?" "Loud and clear," I said quietly, scanning the twisted black tree line ahead of me. "Status?" "Faroon and I are monitoring from the secondary observation post," she said. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to remain calm while you hear it." "Go ahead." "The Kralith stalkers were released 40 minutes ago, 3 specimens, directly into your assigned sector. Instructor Cross falsified the release order under an unrelated ecological survey designation. We have the timestamps recorded." I closed my eyes for a brief moment, feeling the confirmation settle over me with grim finality. "Understood," I said. "Keep recording everything. I'm moving toward the extraction point." The terrain of Kasari was unlike anything I had trained for back on Earth. Jagged black rock formations rising like broken teeth from cracked red soil, twisted vegetation with thorns the length of my forearm, and an oppressive heat that made every breath feel like inhaling through a wet cloth. I moved carefully, using the increased gravity to my advantage rather than fighting against it, keeping my steps low and controlled, my senses stretched wide, listening for anything that did not belong to the natural rhythm of the environment around me. 20 minutes into my trek, I heard it, a low guttural chuffing sound, coming from somewhere behind the rock formation to my left, too deliberate to be wind, too patient to be anything but a predator that had already noticed me. I did not run. Running triggers chase instincts in almost every predator species I had studied, and Kralith stalkers, according to Faroon's research, were ambush hunters who relied heavily on their prey's fear response to determine when to strike. Instead, I slowed my pace deliberately, keeping my breathing controlled, and angled myself toward a narrow crevice between 2 rock formations that would limit how many directions an attack could come from. The chuffing sound grew closer, circling. "Voss, movement detected on thermal, 40 meters northeast of your position," Selvari's voice said tightly through my earpiece. "It's closing distance." "I see it," I whispered, catching the first glimpse of pale, chitinous plating moving between the black rock formations. a creature roughly the size of a large bear, but built low and long, with 6 segmented legs that moved in an unsettling, silent rhythm across the broken ground. The Kralith stalker paused at the edge of my vision, its head, if it could be called that, turning slowly in my direction, revealing a cluster of dark, glassy sensory organs that seemed to register every twitch of movement I made. I did not move. For nearly a full minute, predator and prey remained locked in a silent standoff, neither willing to make the first mistake, and I felt every muscle in my body burning with the effort of remaining perfectly still, despite the adrenaline screaming through my veins. Then the stalker lunged. I threw myself sideways into the crevice, feeling the rush of air as powerful jaws snapped shut inches from where I had been standing, and rolled hard against the unforgiving rock, using the momentum to bring myself back up into a defensive stance. The stalker recovered quickly, twisting its long body with unnatural speed, and I realized immediately that this was not a creature I could outrun or overpower through simple strength. I needed to think, not just fight. I grabbed a jagged stone from the crevice floor and hurled it hard against the rock wall to my right, and the moment the stalker's sensory organs twitched toward the sound, I moved, sprinting low and fast toward the narrow gap between the rock formations where its bulk would struggle to follow quickly. It shrieked, a high, grating sound that set my teeth on edge, and gave chase anyway, forcing its long body through the gap with terrifying speed despite the tight space. Voss, second stalker approaching from the south. Selveri's voice cracked through my earpiece. Urgent now. You're being flanked. I burst out of the crevice into a small clearing, chest heaving, and saw exactly what she meant. A second stalker had positioned itself directly ahead of me, cutting off my planned route toward the extraction point entirely. I was trapped between 2 apex predators, alone, in gravity nearly double what my body had evolved for, with nothing but a training knife and whatever resourcefulness I could summon in the next several seconds. I thought about giving up. I will not pretend that thought did not cross my mind, because pretending otherwise would dishonor exactly how frightening that moment truly was. But then I thought about Faroon, risking his career to warn me. I thought about Selveri, choosing truth over the comfortable assumptions she had grown up believing. I thought about every human who had ever stood at the edge of something impossible and refused to simply lie down and accept it. I did not run. I turned to face them both, planting my feet firmly against the cracked red soil, and let something old and stubborn rise up from somewhere deep inside my chest. Something that had carried my ancestors through ice ages and plagues and every disaster this galaxy could not begin to imagine. The first stalker lunged, and I sidestepped at the last possible moment, driving my knife hard into the joint between its foreleg and body, feeling it shriek in genuine pain for the first time. It was not enough to stop it entirely, but it was enough to slow it, buying precious seconds. The second stalker charged from behind, and I threw myself into a controlled roll beneath its extended jaws, coming up hard against its exposed flank, striking with everything my aching, bruised body had left to give. The fight that followed felt less like a battle and more like a desperate negotiation with exhaustion itself. Every movement measured against how much strength I had left, every strike calculated not for power, but for precision, targeting the same vulnerable joints again and again, until finally, mercifully, both creatures retreated into the tree line, wounded and unwilling to press an attack that had cost them far more than expected. I collapsed against the rock wall, chest heaving, blood running freely from a gash along my forearm, and allowed myself exactly 10 seconds to simply breathe before forcing myself back onto my feet. Voss, Selvari's voice came through, tight with something that sounded almost like relief. Report your status immediately. Alive, I managed. Barely. Moving toward extraction now. There is a complication, she said, and something in her tone made my stomach drop. The secondary observation post has lost contact with a supply team stationed near Grid Point Charlie 4. Faroon believes they encountered the third stalker. How many people? 3 cadets, including Doric. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, feeling exhaustion war against something far older, something that refused to let anyone be left behind if I still had breath left in my lungs. "Send me their coordinates," I said. "Voss, that is nearly a kilometer in the opposite direction of extraction. You are already severely injured." "Send me the coordinates, Selvari." There was a pause, long enough that I wondered if she might refuse entirely, before her voice returned, quiet and resigned. "Coordinates transmitted. Please be careful." I pushed myself away from the rock wall and began moving, every muscle screaming in protest, toward the sound of distant, panicked voices carried faintly on the hot Kisari wind. I found them 20 minutes later, pinned against a rock outcropping by the third stalker, their supply equipment scattered and useless, Doric standing protectively in front of two smaller cadets, with nothing but a broken support strut as a makeshift weapon. The stalker turned the moment it sensed my approach, and for a fraction of a second, its glassy sensory organs seemed to register genuine confusion at the sight of a lone, bleeding human cadet charging directly toward it instead of away. I did not have a clever plan this time. I had exhaustion, determination, and the simple, stubborn refusal to watch 3 people die because someone within these academy walls had decided humanity's resilience was a threat worth quietly eliminating. The fight that followed was brutal, chaotic, and far closer than I would ever admit to Selvari afterward, but between my desperate strikes and Doric's improvised weapon finally finding its mark, the stalker retreated at last, vanishing back into the twisted tree line with a final furious shriek. Doric stared at me, breathing hard, his earlier confidence completely replaced by something raw and unguarded. "You came back for us," he said, disbelief evident in his voice. "You were already clear of danger." "Nobody gets left behind," I said, sinking to my knees, finally allowing the exhaustion to catch up with me completely. "Not if I can help it." The 2 smaller cadets, both wide-eyed and trembling, simply stared at me like I had descended from some old, half-forgotten story, and perhaps, in a way, I had. Selvari's voice crackled urgently through my earpiece. "Extraction shuttle inbound, 3 minutes. Voss, can you move?" I looked up at Doric, who was already extending a hand to help me back to my feet, an expression on his face that had shifted, somewhere over the past 20 minutes, from doubt into something that looked remarkably like loyalty. "I can move," I said, accepting his hand. Together, the 4 of us made our way toward the extraction point beneath a bruised amber sky, and as the shuttle finally descended through the clouds to carry us home, I understood that something fundamental had changed today, not simply in how the Academy would view me, but in how I finally understood my own place among the stars. The legends were not simply about strength, or endurance, or the ability to survive impossible odds. They were about refusing, no matter the cost, to leave anyone behind. The medical bay was crowded when we arrived, nurses and staff rushing between the 4 of us, and through the haze of exhaustion and pain, I caught sight of Commander Vance, standing near the entrance, his face unusually pale as he listened to a report from the shuttle pilot who had extracted us. 3 Kralith stalkers, Vance was saying, disbelief coloring every word. Those are not native to that sector. Someone would have had to authorize their release. "That is precisely what I intend to demonstrate," Selvari said, stepping forward with a datapad clutched tightly in her hands, Faroon close behind her, looking equal parts terrified and determined. Vance turned toward them, his expression hardening. "Explain." Over the next several minutes, while a nurse cleaned and sealed the gash along my forearm, Selvari laid out everything we had discovered, the falsified requisition orders, the time-stamped release of predators, never meant to inhabit that sector, the recorded conversation Faroon had overheard between Instructor Cross and an unidentified logistics officer. Vance listened in silence, his jaw tightening with each new piece of evidence, and when Selvari finally finished, he stood quietly for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular. "This is a serious accusation," he said finally, echoing almost exactly what Selvari herself had said to me a week earlier. "It is a serious truth," she replied, "one I am prepared to present before the full Academy tribunal, along with corroborating testimony from Cadet Idesh and physical evidence of Cadet Voss's injuries, which align precisely with Kralith stalker attack patterns rather than standard survival trial risks." Vance looked at me, still lying on the medical table, bruised and bandaged, and something in his expression shifted, the earlier condescension I had grown accustomed to, replaced by something far more complicated. "Cadet Voss," he said quietly, "is this true?" "Every word," I said. "I completed the trial anyway, but I want it clearly on record that I did not complete it under fair conditions, and that 3 other cadets nearly lost their lives because someone decided humanity's survival was inconvenient for their own interests." Vance nodded slowly, then turned and left the medical bay without another word, his communicator already raised to his ear. By the following morning, Instructor Halden Cross had been summoned before the Academy's disciplinary council, along with the logistics officer who had falsified the requisition documents. I was not present for that hearing, still recovering under medical observation, but Selvari relayed the details to me afterward with visible satisfaction. Cross had denied everything initially, insisting the Predator release had been a genuine ecological oversight, but the time-stamped evidence, combined with the recorded conversation Faroon had captured, left little room for doubt. When confronted directly with the possibility that his sabotage had nearly resulted in the deaths of 4 cadets, including 2 from allied Concordance worlds, his composure finally broke entirely. He admitted in a moment of desperate honesty that he had genuinely believed humanity's admission into the Concordance threatened the delicate balance of power among established member species, that proving the Deathworlder legends false would have protected interests he considered far more important than the life of a single first-year cadet. The disciplinary council did not share his perspective. Cross was stripped of his instructor position and formally reprimanded, his connections to outside defense contractors placed under immediate investigation by Concordance oversight authorities. The logistics officer who had assisted him faced similar consequences, and within days, the entire incident had become the subject of quiet, urgent conversation throughout every level of the Academy, and, I would later learn, well beyond it. 2 weeks after the Kisari trial, I found myself standing outside the entrance to the Academy's central command chamber, summoned for a meeting I had not expected and did not fully understand until the doors slid open to reveal not simply Commander Vance, but an entire assembly of senior Concordance officials, representatives from species I recognized only from textbook images, all seated around a curved table beneath the soft glow of a projected star map. "Cadet Voss," said an elderly Valari woman seated at the center of the table, her voice carrying an authority that immediately silenced the quiet murmur of conversation around her. "I am Director Elsa Thorne, overseeing Concordance Academy operations. Please, sit." I did as instructed, feeling distinctly out of place among officials whose decisions likely shaped policies across dozens of worlds. "The events at Kisari," Director Thorne began, "have raised questions extending well beyond a single instructor's misconduct. Questions about how thoroughly this Concordance truly understood the species it recently welcomed into its ranks." I said nothing, waiting. "For decades," she continued, "the legends of the Deathworlders were treated as convenient folklore, useful perhaps for frightening cadets during orientation, but never taken seriously as historical or biological fact. Your species, Cadet Voss, has forced this Academy, and increasingly this entire Concordance, to reconsider that assumption. With respect, Director," I said carefully, "I never intended to prove anything beyond my own ability to complete a training exercise fairly." "And yet you did prove something far larger," she said, a faint smile crossing her weathered features. "You proved that resilience, adaptability, and loyalty are not qualities exclusive to species with the longest recorded history among the stars. Earth, it seems, has been quietly enduring hardships this Concordance can scarcely imagine, for far longer than any of us realized." She gestured toward the projected star map, where a small, unassuming blue and green planet now glowed at the center of the display, surrounded by data streams I did not fully understand. "We would like you to address the full command staff," Director Thorne said, "and share, in your own words, what your species has endured and how you managed to survive it. Not as a demonstration of strength, Cadet Voss, but as a genuine attempt at understanding." I stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle across my shoulders, heavier in some ways than anything I had faced on Kasari, because this was not a physical battle I could win through endurance alone. This required something far more difficult. Honesty, delivered to an audience that held the future of my entire species in its careful, considered judgment. "My planet," I began, my voice steadier than I expected, "was never kind to the creatures that lived on it, including us. We evolved alongside predators larger and faster than ourselves, survived ice ages that buried entire continents beneath frozen wastelands, endured plagues that erased significant portions of our population within a matter of years, and fought wars against each other that, at times, threatened to destroy everything we had built." The room remained silent, every eye fixed on me. "We do not have natural armor," I continued. "We do not have venom, or claws capable of tearing through stone, or the raw physical strength many species in this concordance take for granted. What we have, instead, is an almost unreasonable refusal to accept defeat as permanent. Every disaster that should have ended us instead became something we adapted around, learned from, and eventually overcame." I thought about Doric, standing protectively over two frightened cadets on a hostile alien world, about Faroon risking his career to warn me of danger, about Selvari choosing uncomfortable truth over comfortable assumption. "The old stories about Deathworlders were never really about strength," I said. "They were about stubbornness, about refusing to leave anyone behind, refusing to accept that survival was impossible simply because the odds said otherwise. That is not a myth, Director Thorne. That is simply who we are." For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Director Thorne rose slowly from her seat, and to my genuine surprise, inclined her head toward me in a gesture I recognized, from my limited cultural training, as a sign of deep respect among Valari officials. "Thank you, Cadet Voss," she said quietly. "This concordance owes your species a more thoughtful welcome than the one it initially offered. I intend to see that corrected, starting today." The weeks that followed brought changes I could not have predicted 3 months earlier, when I had first stepped onto Academy grounds as an uncertain, underestimated curiosity. Formal inquiries into humanity's history began circulating among concordant scholars, no longer treated as mere folklore, but as genuine subject worthy of serious study. Diplomatic discussions regarding Earth's full membership status accelerated considerably, and I later learned that Instructor Cross's exposed sabotage had inadvertently strengthened humanity's negotiating position more than any single act of strength ever could have, proof that fear, not disrespect, had driven the attempt against me in the first place. Doric and I became close friends, an unlikely pairing that neither of us had expected when we first faced each other across that training mat weeks earlier. He often joked that he owed me his life twice over, once for showing him that strength alone was never enough, and once for refusing to leave him behind on Kasari when doing so would have been far easier. Selvari, true to her nature, remained relentlessly analytical about everything that had happened, though I noticed, over time, that her analytical questions about humanity gradually shifted from skeptical interrogation toward genuine, thoughtful curiosity, the kind born not from doubt, but from real respect. Faroon, quietly celebrated within the science division for his integrity in exposing Cross's sabotage, continued his research into human physiology with renewed enthusiasm, eventually publishing findings that would reshape how the wider concordance understood Deathworld biology entirely. 3 months after the Kasari trial, I stood once again in the same training room where this entire story had begun, though now as something closer to a mentor than a curiosity, watching a new class of first-year cadets file nervously into their seats. A young Savathi cadet, small and visibly uncertain among her larger, more confident classmates, caught my attention immediately, reminding me sharply of myself on that very first day. An instructor, new to the academy following Cross's dismissal, began the same tired routine I remembered so vividly, recounting old legends about mythical Deathworlders as though they were nothing more than exaggerated campfire stories, meant to entertain rather than inform. Several cadets laughed, exactly as my own classmates once had. The instructor turned toward the nervous young cadet, asking, almost mockingly, whether she believed such legends could possibly be true. I watched her hesitate, watched doubt and fear war visibly across her young features, watched her glance toward her classmates for reassurance she clearly was not going to find. I stepped forward from where I had been quietly observing near the back of the room, and the instructor, along with every cadet present, turned to look at me with surprise. "Cadet Voss," the instructor said, clearly recognizing my name from academy records. "Perhaps you would care to offer your perspective." I looked past him, directly at the young, uncertain Savathi cadet, and offered her the same quiet, steady confidence that Selvari had once offered me during my own darkest, most uncertain moment. "Legends," I said, "are not always exaggerations. Sometimes they are simply truths that nobody has bothered to properly listen to yet." I turned toward the young cadet, extending an open hand in silent invitation. "Go ahead," I said gently. "Raise your hand." She hesitated only a moment longer before finally, slowly, lifting her hand into the air, her uncertain expression giving way, gradually, to something resembling quiet, determined courage. The room fell silent, the same heavy, expectant silence I remembered so clearly from my own first demonstration, and I felt, watching her, a profound sense of completion, a story that had begun with doubt and fear, finally circling back around into something resembling hope. Legends, I had learned, were never simply born from strength alone. They were born from the courage to stand up, again and again, no matter how many times the galaxy insisted you could not, and to prove, through quiet, stubborn persistence, exactly how wrong that insistence truly was.